The king died with more dignity than he ever lived with power. January 30th, 1649, London. The Thames had frozen solid that winter, the coldest anyone could remember. And on a scaffold built in front of Whitehall Palace, a man in a black coat stepped forward into a morning so sharp it hurt to breathe. He was stubborn where he should have bent, and he bent where he should have stood firm. He lied to his allies, outmaneuvered himself at every turn, and managed to start 2 civil wars in the same decade. But in those final minutes, standing above 10,000 silent faces, Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was something else entirely. He was calm, completely, impossibly calm. He adjusted his hair. He said a few words. He lay down. One stroke of the axe, and the crowd let out a sound that witnesses couldn't describe as anything but a groan. A single involuntary moan from thousands of people who had just watched something they didn't quite believe was possible. Because it wasn't supposed to be. No king had ever been put on trial by his own subjects in the history of the Western world. No court of law had ever sentenced a reigning monarch to death. What happened in England between 1640 and 1649 wasn't just a civil war. It was a rupture in the idea of what power was, where it came from, and who it belonged to. And the shockwaves from that single axe blow reached a century into the future, crossed an ocean, and ended up buried inside the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the political imagination of every founding father who ever picked up a pen. This is the story of how a king got killed. Not by an assassin in the dark, not by a rival claimant to the throne, but by lawyers in a courtroom in broad daylight in front of a crowd. And why that changed everything. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel is where history gets told the way it deserves. Not like a textbook, but like the wild, brutal, fascinating story it actually is. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from right now. I'm genuinely curious. And if it's past midnight wherever you are, respect. Let's get into it. So what kind of man was Charles Stuart? What kind of king? And how did a reigning monarch, anointed by God, beloved by thousands, end up with his neck on a block outside his own palace? Picture a child nobody expected to survive. Charles was born in 1600 in a Scottish palace, the second son of King James I. His older brother Henry was everything a future king should be. Tall, athletic, charismatic, the kind of prince people pointed at in the street. Charles was the opposite. He was sickly, small, slow to walk, slow to talk. The court doctors weren't sure he'd make it to adulthood. Noble families reportedly refused to take him in as a ward because they were afraid the prince might die in their house and leave them with the scandal. When his father moved the court to London, Charles stayed behind in Scotland for months because he was considered too fragile to make the journey. He did survive, but he grew up in the shadow of a brother everyone loved and a father who mostly ignored him. And when Henry died suddenly at 18, typhoid fever, brutal and fast, 12-year-old Charles became the heir to 3 kingdoms. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because he'd been prepared for it, because death reshuffled the deck and left him holding all the cards. What happened next is what always happens when someone is handed enormous power before they're ready for it. Charles built walls. He became rigid where he should have been fluid. He wrapped himself in certainty because uncertainty terrified him. He believed, genuinely, deeply, without a shred of doubt, that kings were appointed by God, answerable only to God, and that any challenge to royal authority was not just politically wrong, but spiritually corrupt. This wasn't arrogance. It was theology. It was the foundation of his entire personality. And here's where it gets complicated. Because on a personal level, by all accounts, Charles was a decent man. He was faithful to his wife, remarkable for a king of that era. He loved his children. He was a serious patron of the arts, one of the greatest art collectors in English history. He spoke quietly, moved carefully, thought before he acted. He had none of his father's vulgarity, none of his grandfather's wild recklessness. People who met him in private often came away surprised by how thoughtful he was, how gentle even. But put him in a room with Parliament, and something curdled. Because Parliament was, in his mind, the enemy of God's order. Parliament was men presuming to tell a king what to do. And that, for Charles, was simply not acceptable. It was not a negotiating position. It was a matter of principle so deep it felt like bone. He came to the throne in 1625 and immediately began doing the things that would destroy him. He raised taxes without Parliament's consent. He forced wealthy subjects to make loans to the crown, loans that were never repaid. He quartered soldiers in private homes. He dissolved Parliament twice in 3 years when it refused to give him money without conditions. And when Parliament finally came back for a third session and presented him with the Petition of Right, a document that said essentially, "You cannot do these things. These are the ancient liberties of Englishmen," he signed it, went home, and then violated almost every provision within months. This is the pattern that defines his reign. Charles would agree to something under pressure. Then, when the pressure eased, he'd find a way around it. He didn't see this as lying. He saw it as a king exercising his God-given discretion. Parliament saw it as exactly what it was, a man who could not be trusted. In 1629, he dissolved Parliament again and ruled alone, without any representative assembly, for 11 years. 11 years. To fund his government, he revived ancient medieval taxes that hadn't been collected in generations. He sold monopolies. He squeezed money out of the legal system. He ran a country of millions of people essentially as a personal project, accountable to no one. And for a while, it worked. England wasn't at war. The economy held together. His Archbishop, William Laud, was reshaping the Church of England in ways Charles loved. More ceremony, more ritual, more beauty in the liturgy. And the Puritans, who hated all of it, were emigrating to America by the thousands. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Those Puritan émigrés, the ones getting on boats to Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they were carrying something with them across the Atlantic. Not just their faith, a political wound, a bone-deep conviction that power unchecked became tyranny, and tyranny was the greatest sin a government could commit.
They were building new communities in the wilderness, but they were building them in reaction to Charles.
The whole tradition of congregational self-governance, of town meetings, of citizens making decisions for themselves, it grew directly from the soil of English Puritanism, which grew directly from the conflict with this king. The Founding Fathers didn't invent distrust of centralized power from scratch. They inherited it from these people, from this fight. But back in England, the lid was getting tighter on a pot that was starting to boil. The explosion, when it came, started in Scotland, and it started with a prayer book. In 1637, Charles decided to impose a new Anglican liturgy on the Scottish Church. Scotland was Presbyterian, fiercely, proudly, constitutionally Presbyterian. Their church had no bishops. Their worship was plain and unadorned, and they believed with everything they had that this was God's design. And Charles, sitting in London, 400 miles away, decided to tell them how to pray. The first time the new prayer book was read aloud in Edinburgh's cathedral, a woman named Jenny Geddes, at least that's the legend, stood up grabbed her folding stool, and hurled it at the bishop's head. __quote _0___, she allegedly shouted. Whether or not that's exactly what happened, what came next definitely did. Riots. Then a national covenant, the Scottish National Covenant of 1638, signed by tens of thousands of Scots who pledged to defend their church against royal interference. Then an army. Scotland raised an army and marched it south. Charles had no money for a war. He had no proper army. He had nothing, because he'd been ruling without parliament for 11 years and had deliberately kept his military forces weak to avoid the political cost of maintaining them. He was forced to do what he'd sworn he would never do again: call Parliament back. The Parliament that assembled in 1640 was not the same body he'd sent home in 1629. These were men who had spent 11 years watching a king break his word, squeeze the country for money, and reshape the church into something that looked uncomfortably close to Rome. They were not in a mood to simply hand over funds and go home. They had a list, and the list was long. Within months, the Long Parliament, as it came to be known because it sat in various forms for 13 years, had abolished the king's most despised tax schemes, shut down his secret courts, passed a law requiring Parliament to meet at least every 3 years whether the king wanted it or not, and passed another law saying that Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. This Parliament, in other words, declared itself permanent. Charles was forced to sign all of it. Then Parliament went further. It arrested the king's 2 most powerful ministers, the Earl of Strafford, who'd been running Ireland as a personal fiefdom, and Archbishop Laud. Strafford was impeached, tried, and executed in 1641. Charles had promised Strafford he would protect him. He signed the execution warrant anyway. It was the decision that haunted him most, right up until the moment he himself went to the block. In his final speech on the scaffold, he would say he believed his own death was divine punishment for that betrayal. Strafford's blood, he would say, had demanded his own. But that was still years away. First came the war. The final break happened in January 1642. Charles had had enough. He arrived at the House of Commons with 400 armed soldiers, which was not a thing kings did, which had never been a thing kings did, and demanded the arrest of 5 parliamentary leaders he accused of treason. But the leaders had been warned. They were gone. __quote _1__, Charles said, looking around the empty chamber. The room was silent. And then, as he walked back out through the streets, the London crowd lined up along his route and chanted a phrase that must have felt like ice water poured directly into his chest. Quote 2. "The ancient right of Parliament to protect its members from the Crown," repeated like a drumbeat until he was gone. Charles left London. He never came back as a free man. He went north, to York, where the royalist gentry were loyal and the air was colder, and the politics, he hoped, were simpler. He raised his standard. Literally, he planted a royal banner in the ground, the medieval signal that a king was going to war, on the 22nd of August, 1642. The English Civil War had begun. What followed was 7 years of fighting that tore England apart in ways that still mapped onto the landscape decades later. North and west for the king, the old aristocracy, the Anglican clergy, the Catholic gentry who kept their heads down and their loyalties quiet. South and east for Parliament, London, the port towns, the Puritan merchants, the new money, the people who understood that the future looked different from the past. The royalists were called Cavaliers. The parliamentarians were called Roundheads because of the close-cropped hair some of them wore, a mark of Puritan seriousness in an age when Cavaliers wore their locks long and perfumed. In the early going, the king's forces had the better of it.
The Royalists had more trained cavalry officers. They had dash and aggression. At the Battle of Edge Hill in October 1642, it looked for a moment like Charles might sweep straight to London and end the whole thing in a single afternoon. He didn't. The cavalry swept past the enemy flank and then just kept going, looting the baggage train, stopping to celebrate. Undisciplined, chaotic, burning their momentum in a single glorious, pointless charge. Parliament regrouped, and into this grinding, brutal war stepped a man from the English countryside who would become one of the most consequential figures in modern political history. His name was Oliver Cromwell, and he was, when all this started, a middling Cambridgeshire farmer of no particular distinction. He had served briefly in Parliament. He'd never led troops in battle. He was 43 years old, which was not young for a new military career. What Cromwell understood, and what he turned into a military revolution, was this: faith beats aristocracy on a battlefield. He recruited soldiers not from the tenant farmers of great lords, but from the convinced Puritan communities of Eastern England. Men who believed they were fighting God's war, who sang psalms before battle, who didn't plunder and rape their way through the countryside because their religion forbade it, who were sober when other armies were drunk, and disciplined when other armies were chaos. He made them practice. He made them drill. He paid them, or tried to. He created from essentially nothing what became known as the New Model Army. And with it, he changed the entire calculus of the war. The moment the war turned came at Naseby in June 1645. Parliament's forces smashed the Royalist army, utterly, completely smashed it. And when they went through the baggage train afterward, they found something that changed the political temperature of the entire country: the king's private correspondence. Letters from Charles to Catholic powers on the continent asking for military support. Letters describing how his promises to Parliament were tactical, not sincere. Things he said to buy time, not commitments he intended to honor. Everything his opponents had suspected. Everything they'd been accused of fabricating. Right there, in the king's own handwriting. The letters were published. The country read them. And whatever lingering trust remained between Charles and any parliamentary moderate, whatever hope there was for a negotiated settlement, evaporated in the afternoon sun of a Northamptonshire field. Charles fled north. He surrendered to the Scottish army, hoping for protection from his father's people. The Scots held him for months, negotiating, trying to extract a promise to adopt Presbyterian worship in England. Charles refused. He would not compromise on the church. The Scots eventually decided they'd gotten everything they were going to get, and they sold him to the English Parliament for a settlement of debts. A transaction so cold-blooded, it reads like a line from a thriller. The king sold. Parliament held him. He escaped. Parliament recaptured him. He negotiated. He deceived. He made secret deals with the Scots to invade England again in exchange for promising to trial Presbyterianism for 3 years, a promise everyone suspected he would find a way to break. The Second Civil War erupted and was crushed, and by the end of 1648, the army, Cromwell's army, the new model army that had fought and bled and prayed its way through years of battle, had had enough. The army presented Parliament with its demand. Charles Stuart must answer for the blood he'd spilled. Not abdicate, not exile. Answer. In a court of law. Something remarkable happened next, and it tells you everything about what was actually at stake. A significant portion of Parliament, the moderate Presbyterian members who had fought against the king but still believed in monarchy as a system, refused. They thought a trial was too dangerous, too radical, too far outside any recognizable legal tradition. They wanted a deal. They were still negotiating with Charles when, in December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride showed up at the doors of Parliament with a regiment of soldiers and a list of names. Anyone on the list was turned away, physically barred from entering. Some were arrested. The members who remained, about a fifth of the original Parliament, maybe 60 or 70 men, became known as the Rump Parliament, and they were ready to do what they believed needed to be done. On the first day of January 1649, the Rump Parliament passed an act creating a High Court of Justice for the trial of the King of England. 135 commissioners were named. About half of them showed up to the proceedings. They would be judge and jury both. General Thomas Fairfax, the commander of the parliamentary forces, a brilliant soldier who had won battle after battle for Parliament, refused to serve. His wife, watching from the public gallery on the first day of the trial, shouted out when Fairfax's name was called as a commissioner. Quote 3. She was not removed. Nobody quite knew what to do about a woman shouting from the gallery at the court trying to execute a king. Even Cromwell hesitated. He reportedly paced his room for hours. He prayed. He told a colleague that if any man had shown him a way to save England without this act, he would have taken it. Nobody had. Charles was brought to Westminster Hall on the 20th of January, 1649. He walked in wearing a tall black hat. He did not remove it. A king did not bare his head to his inferiors, and he had decided, somewhere in the cold certainty of his faith, that whatever this room was, it was not his superior. The hall was enormous, one of the oldest parts of the palace complex, stone walls that had stood for 5 centuries, high timber roof, galleries packed with spectators. The sound of hundreds of people breathing in a cold room, the smell of wool and candle smoke and damp stone. And in the center of all of it, alone, one small man in black, refusing to take off his hat. John Bradshaw, the lawyer who served as president of the court, read the charges. Charles Stuart was accused of having traitorously and maliciously levied war against Parliament and the people it represented. He was accused of responsibility for all the deaths, destruction, and suffering of the civil wars. He was accused of being a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy. Charles laughed. Not from nerves, from what sounded like genuine contempt. Quote 4, he said. Quote 5. He looked around the room. Quote 6. Bradshaw tried to answer. Charles interrupted. Quote 7. He kept returning to the same demand. Show me the law. Show me the precedent. And here's the thing. He had a point. There was no law. There was no precedent. They were making it up as they went, and everyone in that room knew it. The king's legal argument was genuinely strong. His moral argument was something else entirely. They went back and forth like this for 3 days. Charles refused to enter a plea. He refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction. Without a plea, under English law, no trial could proceed. The prosecutors improvised. They called witnesses to establish the facts of the charges without the king's participation. They pushed through regardless. And on the 27th of January, 40 years after Charles had entered the world in a Scottish palace as a sickly child nobody expected to survive, Bradshaw read the verdict. Guilty, tyrant, traitor, enemy of England. The sentence: death by the severing of his head from his body. 59 commissioners signed the death warrant. Later, under the restored monarchy, those signatures would be treated as murder confessions. Some of the signatories would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Some fled to America and died in exile in New Haven and Hadley, Massachusetts. Towns that sheltered them, protected them, built their communities partly around the idea that what they had done was right.
The names of those commissioners are written into American soil in ways we've mostly forgotten. But that's later. In January 1649, the warrant was signed, the date was set, and Charles had 3 days. 3 days to prepare, 3 days to pray with his bishop, 3 days to write letters to his children, letters full of the kind of lucid, heartbreaking advice that you only achieve when you know you will never be able to say it in person. He told his son to put his faith in God above all political calculation. He told him not to seek revenge. He wrote to the daughter who was imprisoned in the tower, and what he wrote to her made her weep for days. He was, by all accounts in those final hours, the most composed person in the building. The night before the execution, a soldier was found trying to tunnel under the scaffold. Whether he was trying to bring it down to save the king or to plant something beneath it, no one was quite sure. He was arrested. The scaffold was checked. Guards were posted through the night on the frozen streets around Whitehall. The whole city felt like something coiled, waiting. And somewhere in those night hours, Cromwell, who had signed the warrant, who had driven this whole catastrophe to its conclusion, was in his rooms. What he was thinking, whether he slept, whether he prayed or wept, or simply stared at the ceiling of a palace that was about to become a site of execution, that is the question the morning would answer for him, whether he was ready or not. The pen was already in his hand when the hardest moment came. Not before. Not during the weeks of argument, the prayers, the scripture he'd recited to himself like a man pressing a wound to stop bleeding. The worst of it arrived at the worst possible moment, when the warrant was spread flat on the table and the ink was wet, and all that remained was the physical act of pressing his name into history. Oliver Cromwell looked down at the document, and then, according to men who were in the room, he looked up at the face of Henry Martin, a fellow commissioner seated across the table, and he did something nobody expected. He reached over and wiped a streak of ink across Martin's face. Martin blinked. Then he reached over and did the same to Cromwell. Two men, about to authorize the execution of their king, marking each other with the ink they were using to do it. Whether it was a release of unbearable tension, a moment of shared dark humor between men who knew exactly what they were about to become, or some wordless acknowledgement that they were crossing a line together and couldn't cross back, no one recorded, but they both signed. Cromwell's signature sits third on the warrant. You can still read it. The handwriting is confident. It does not look like the hand of a man who hesitated. Don't let that fool you. The confidence on paper was the product of something Cromwell had been building toward for years. A theology of action that he'd constructed specifically to survive moments like this one. He was a Calvinist, which meant he believed in predestination, which meant he believed that everything happening was already written in God's plan before the world began. This wasn't fatalism for Cromwell. It was permission. If God had ordained that England would be delivered from tyranny, and if the evidence of the battlefield, all those victories, all those improbable triumphs against superior royalist forces pointed to God's favor, then opposing that deliverance was the true sin. Not the execution, the hesitation. He told associates that he'd searched his heart, that he'd looked for another way, that the king's repeated deceptions, the secret treaties, the Second Civil War that cost thousands of lives, Charles had done this. Charles had forced the calculation. The blood on the warrant was blood the king had already drawn. Whether he believed all of this completely, or whether he needed to believe it to function, that's a question historians have been arguing about for 3.5 centuries without landing anywhere definitive. What we know is that Cromwell signed and then turned immediately to the business of carrying the thing through before anyone could stop it. That's not the behavior of a man at peace. That's the behavior of a man who knows that momentum is the only thing keeping doubt at bay.
Cromwell was not a simple fanatic. He was one of the most complex political animals of his century. He had wept openly when the Earl of Strafford was executed, wept while supporting the execution. He had described the king as a man against whom the Lord hath witnessed, and also privately expressed something close to admiration for Charles's composure under pressure. He seemed to hold contradictions the way other men held tools: useful, necessary. Pick up the right one for the right job, and don't ask too many questions about the others. He wanted a settlement with the king, until he didn't. He wanted to preserve Parliament, until he didn't. He would eventually dismiss the very Parliament he'd fought for, with words that could have come straight from Charles Stuart's mouth. "You are no Parliament." He became, within a few years, the thing he'd gone to war to destroy. A single man, ruling England by personal authority, unchecked, unaccountable, answerable to nothing but God and his own conscience. But that bitter turn was still ahead. On the day he signed the warrant, he was still the revolution. And the revolution needed to happen before anyone thought too hard about what came after it. Meanwhile, in Westminster Hall, the courtroom had become something that had never existed before in the history of law. Think about what was actually assembled there. A new court, created by a parliament that had been purged of anyone who disagreed with the outcome, trying a king who refused to recognize the court's existence, on charges for which there was no legal precedent, in a proceeding that mixed criminal trial with political theater in a way that made everyone uncomfortable, including the prosecutors. The air in that room wasn't just tension. It was the smell of something being invented in real time. And everyone involved knew that if it went wrong, it wouldn't just be bad for them personally. It would set a precedent in the wrong direction. It would prove that courts couldn't touch kings. It would prove that monarchs were, in fact, above the law. John Bradshaw understood this. He showed up to the trial wearing a specially reinforced hat, lined with metal, it's said, because the threats against him were specific and credible. His voice, when he addressed the court, was the voice of a man performing certainty he did not entirely feel. He had to perform it. He was the anchor of an entire legal fiction, and if his confidence cracked, the fiction collapsed with it. Charles played the room brilliantly. You have to give him that. For a man who had been a disastrous politician for 24 years, he found in this courtroom a kind of clarity that had eluded him his entire reign. He never raised his voice. He never showed fear. He asked precise, pointed legal questions that Bradshaw couldn't answer directly without exposing the weaknesses in the prosecution's position. He kept returning to the same place, with the calm insistence of a man who knows the ground under him is solid, even if the building above is on fire. Show me the law. Not the power, the law. Point to the statute. Name the precedent. Cite the authority. When Bradshaw told him that the court derived its authority from the people of England, Charles responded with something that stopped the room cold. The people of England, he said, were his subjects. He was their king by right of birth and by law that predated this parliament, this court, this army, any institution currently claiming authority over him. He had not consented to be governed by them. They had no power he had not given them. To let this court try him was not an act of humility. It was a betrayal of every English subject. Because if a king could be put on trial by his own creation, then no law was safe, no property was secure, no liberty was real. The commons and liberty of England, he told them, are more mine to vindicate than yours. The gallery went completely still. Not because they agreed with him, because they couldn't immediately answer him. There was a moment, just a moment, where the room itself seemed to recalibrate. Then Bradshaw, recovered, pressed forward, and the machinery ground on. The witnesses were called without the king's participation.
Soldiers testified that they'd seen Charles in the field commanding royalist forces. Officers described battles. The facts of the charges were established by the court's own terms.
Charles sat through all of it, in that tall black hat he refused to remove, sometimes leaning forward on his cane, sometimes looking almost bored, occasionally making a quiet remark to one of his attendants that made the attendant's expression flicker. He was building something in those days in court, building it carefully, brick by brick, out of silence and dignity and the deliberate refusal to panic. He was constructing the figure who would walk out onto the scaffold. He was composing himself into a martyr before he died. On the last day, Bradshaw read a long address before delivering the verdict. He told Charles that the court had considered every argument, had found no defense in law or reason, had determined that the charges were proven. He said that the court was bound, by God, by justice, by the blood of all those who had died in the wars, to pronounce sentence. Charles tried to speak. 3 times he tried to speak before the verdict was formally pronounced, and 3 times Bradshaw silenced him. Charles stood up. He said quietly. The sentence was read. The hall dissolved into noise. Soldiers in the gallery began shouting, "Quote 13," the word percussion against stone walls. Spectators in the public seats pushed and craned to see, and Charles, surrounded by soldiers, was led out of Westminster Hall and back into the cold. Outside, on the street, when people recognized him, they called to him. Quote 14. It was still what people said. It was still the reflex, even now. He had 3 days left. He'd already begun spending them. The rooms they gave him at St. James's Palace were not unkind. He had a fire. He had his bishop, William Juxon, who had been his confessor for years and who would stay with him until the end. He had his children for one final visit, Henry and Elizabeth, who were held in the palace, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough that it would mark them forever. Elizabeth was 13. She sat with her father, and she tried to memorize everything. She recorded the conversation afterward because she couldn't bear for it to be lost. He told her he died a Christian, according to the Church of England. He told her to forgive those who had done this, not for their sake, but for her own. He told her not to grieve for him. She wrote all of it down. She died 8 months later in Carisbrooke Castle, of what was recorded as grief. The nights were different from the days. During the day there were people, guards, attendants, his bishop, visitors given brief permission to see him. At night, the palace contracted to something smaller and colder, and much more honest. Candles burned low in iron holders and threw long shadows across stone floors. The Thames outside was still partially frozen. The city made its winter sounds. Iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, a dog somewhere across the water, the distant creak of boats in the cold. These were the sounds Charles had grown up hearing. London at night, a city he had ruled and lost and would not see again. He slept, or tried to. He prayed, certainly, in that specific Anglican form that was to him not just religion, but identity. The Book of Common Prayer, the rhythm of its language, the cadences he'd known since childhood. The same prayer book he'd tried to force on Scotland and started this whole catastrophe with. He read. He was given books, and he read them. Bishop Juxon stayed close. The 2 men talked in low voices through parts of the night. The kind of conversation you have when there's nothing left to protect and nothing left to perform. In those hours, Charles thought about what he would say from the scaffold, and he thought about how he would say it. He understood, with a clarity his reign had rarely given him, that the speech he gave from that platform might be the only thing that survived him. Not his legacy as ruler, his reputation there was beyond saving, but the manner of his dying, the words he chose,
The face he showed to those 10,000 people in the cold. That could be shaped. That could be made to mean something. He was becoming, in his final hours, a political actor of a kind he'd never quite managed to be in life. The throne had made him small. The scaffold was about to make him something else entirely. Dawn came slowly over the Thames, gray and flat, the kind of English January morning where the light arrives apologetically, without warmth, without color. The city was already filling. People had come in from the countryside. The streets around Whitehall were dense with bodies, breath rising in white clouds above thousands of upturned faces. The scaffold had been built between the banqueting house and the street, the same banqueting house whose ceilings Charles had commissioned Rubens to paint with images of divine kingship, his father James ascending to heaven, the wisdom of royal rule made visible in oil and gold. He would walk through that building to reach the platform where he would die. Whether this was exquisitely cruel or simply the most practical route, nobody said. In 1649, those two things were often the same. The guards came for him early. He dressed carefully, methodically, in 2 shirts. The morning was brutal with cold, and he'd ask for the second shirt so he wouldn't shiver on the scaffold and have the crowd think he was afraid. That detail, more than almost anything else in this story, reaches across nearly 4 centuries and lands somewhere in the chest. A man putting on an extra shirt because he won't let the cold make him look frightened. The last careful decision of a king who had rarely made careful decisions. This one he got exactly right. He was ready. The door opened. The sound of the city poured in. It hit him like a wall. Not the roar of a crowd at a celebration, something stranger than that. Something harder to name. 10,000 people packed into the streets around Whitehall, and most of them were quiet. That was the thing witnesses kept coming back to afterward. The detail that refused to leave them. Not the noise. The silence inside the noise. The shuffle of thousands of bodies pressing forward. The creak of wooden barriers. The occasional shout from somewhere back in the crowd. But underneath all of it, this vast, held breath stillness. The sound of a city that doesn't know what it's watching, that has never seen anything like this, and understands, in some animal way, that it is standing at the edge of something it cannot take back. Charles walked through the banqueting house. He walked under the ceiling. He didn't look up. Whether he couldn't bear to, or whether he'd already made peace with the particular cruelty of that route, nobody recorded. He walked steadily, which was the thing everyone noticed. Not fast, not slow. The walk of a man who has decided on his pace and will not be hurried or frightened out of it. Bishop Juxon walked beside him. The guards moved around them both. And then the door at the end of the banqueting house opened, and the cold came through it like a blade. And Charles stepped out onto the scaffold, and the city saw him. The groan that went through the crowd. Witnesses used that word over and over. Groan. Not shout, not cheer. Groan. Happened before he even reached the block. Just the sight of him. Just the fact of him standing there in the January air, in his 2 shirts, bareheaded now, the wind moving through his hair, his face composed into something that didn't look like a performance, because by now it wasn't. It was just his face. The face of a man who had been afraid, and had moved through the fear, and come out the other side into some territory that fear doesn't reach. He looked out at the crowd, and he knew, immediately, that they were too far back. The barriers kept them at a distance. Whatever he said from this platform, most of them would not hear it. He understood that the speech he'd prepared was now something else. Not an address to the crowd, but a statement for the record, for the men standing close enough to write it down, for the printed pages that would carry it across England and across the Channel, into courts and coffee houses and churches in a dozen languages. He spoke anyway. He spoke as if every word mattered, because it did. He said he was an innocent man. He said that the people's liberty consisted not in sharing government, but in having those laws by which their lives and goods were most their own. A line that political philosophers would be quoting for the next 2 centuries. He said that he forgave everyone who had brought him here, that he bore no malice, that he died a Christian of the Church of England. He said that he went from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance could be. Then he paused. He tucked his hair up under a white satin cap and turned to the masked executioner standing beside the block. He said something quiet, too quiet for most people to hear. He asked him to wait for his signal. He would stretch out his hands when he was ready. He didn't want to be caught by surprise. He didn't want the axe to fall before he'd made his final prayer. He knelt. The block was low. Insultingly low, it was later noted, forcing him almost to lie flat rather than kneel upright. Another small humiliation baked into the architecture of the moment. He arranged himself. He prayed. His lips moved. Juxon leaned close. "There is but one stage more," the bishop said. "This stage is turbulent and troublesome. It is a short one, but you are stepping from a temporal to an eternal crown." "I go," Charles said, "from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." He stretched out his hands. The identity of the executioner has never been proven beyond doubt. History points most persistently toward Richard Brandon, the most skilled headsman in England at the time, a man who denied any involvement until his death, and whose guilt, like so much else in this story, remains a matter of record and inference rather than certainty. Whoever stood behind that mask, one stroke, clean. So fast that the body didn't seem to understand for a half-second what had happened, and then the head was lifted, shown to the crowd, and the executioner said the ritual words, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 19, underscore, underscore. And the crowd made that sound again. That sound no one could describe properly. That enormous groaning exhalation, like something releasing from the chest of an entire city at once. A woman fainted. Several men near the front of the barriers turned away. Others pushed forward. Some dipped cloths and handkerchiefs in the blood pooling on the scaffold boards. Not from violence, not from hatred, but from the opposite impulse. The ancient human instinct to take a piece of a martyr, to carry some particle of the sacred thing away from the place where it happened. A king was dead. The first king in the history of the Western world to be tried, convicted, and executed by the legal authority of his own state. And nobody, not Cromwell, not Bradshaw, not the 59 men who signed their names to the warrant, had any idea what came next. What came next arrived with a speed that should have been a warning. Within hours of the execution, the presses were running. Not just in London, across Europe. The news traveled by ship and horse and word of mouth at the fastest speed information could move in the 17th century, and it still felt, to the people receiving it, like something instantaneous, like a shock that jumped distances without any medium to carry it. In Paris, Henrietta Maria, Charles's French wife, who had spent years trying to raise money and troops for her husband from the courts of Europe, collapsed when she heard. She had been in the middle of a meal. The table was cleared around her, and she was carried to her rooms, and for days she did not come out. In the Dutch Republic, in the courts of German princes, in Spain, in Sweden, in Rome, the reaction was the same. Disbelief. Then horror, then something that functioned like fear. Not fear of England, necessarily. Fear of the idea. Because what England had just demonstrated was not merely that a revolution could succeed. That had happened before, in various forms, various places. What England had demonstrated was that a revolution could formalize itself, could put on a wig and call itself a court,
could write charges on parchment, present evidence, pronounce a verdict, and execute a sentence, could kill a king with paperwork. This was new. This was genuinely, terrifyingly new. And every monarch in Europe looked at it and understood in the most visceral way possible that the ground had shifted under their feet. The royalist response came fast, and it came brilliantly. Within days of Charles's death, a book appeared. It was called Icon Basilicae, the royal portrait, or the image of the king. It purported to be Charles's own meditations, his prayers, his reflections, written during his captivity. Whether he actually wrote it, whether his chaplain, John Gordon, ghost wrote it, whether it was a collaboration, historians still argue about this, and they likely always will. What nobody argues about is its effect. It was a sensation. It went through 35 editions in the year of publication alone. It was translated across Europe. It depicted Charles as a suffering Christian king, patient, forgiving, wronged but unbowed, a martyr in the most literal theological sense. It took the execution, which Cromwell had planned as an act of justice, and reframed it as an act of sacred murder. It made Charles a saint, and people believed it because they had watched him on that scaffold, and what they'd seen was consistent with every word on the page. Cromwell was furious. He commissioned John Milton, yes, that Milton, the poet who would write Paradise Lost, one of the great literary geniuses of the English language, to write the government's response.
Milton produced a counterpamphlet, Iconoclastes, the Image Breaker, which argued, brilliantly and exhaustively, that Charles had been a tyrant and deserved his fate, that the people had the right to judge their rulers, that no ruler stood beyond accountability. It was a masterwork of political argument. It was read by far fewer people than Icon Basilicae. The dead king was winning the propaganda war. And then the deeper ironies began to accumulate. Cromwell ruled England for the next 9 years, first through successive purged parliaments, then eventually without parliament at all, under the title of Lord Protector, a title that fooled nobody, least of all Cromwell himself. He refused the crown when it was offered, because accepting it would have made a mockery of everything he'd said he stood for. But he exercised royal power in every practical sense. He closed theatres. He banned certain kinds of music. He imposed the moral legislation of the Puritan faith on a population that had not, in its majority, asked for it. He crushed Ireland with a ferocity that left scars visible for centuries. He crushed Scotland. He was, depending on your perspective, one of the most effective rulers England ever had, and one of the most despotic. He died in 1658 of fever. The exact cause remains debated by historians, with malaria, typhoid, and other complications all proposed at various points. He died in bed, which was more than his king managed. His son Richard succeeded him as Lord Protector, and lasted about 8 months before the army decided he was useless and the whole thing started to unravel. And in 1660, just over 11 years after the execution, with barely a shot fired, the monarchy was restored. Charles II, the dead king's son, who had been living in exile in France, playing cards and charming aristocratic ladies, and waiting with the long patience of someone who has no other options, sailed back to Dover and rode through streets lined with cheering crowds. And England returned to what it had been, or tried to. It couldn't, of course. You can restore a king. You cannot unthink a thought. Here is what had happened during those 11 years, and here is why it matters to every person watching this who has ever voted in an election, signed a petition, argued about the limits of government authority, or simply assumed that rulers could be held accountable for their actions. The revolution produced an argument. Not a single, simple argument, but an ecosystem of arguments, questions, competing frameworks, all circling the same central problem. If kings can be deposed, if rulers can be tried, if sovereignty comes from somewhere other than God's grace and hereditary right, where does it come from? Who holds it? Who can take it back? John Milton had argued it one way. The people are sovereign. Tyranny dissolves the contract. Justice is the people's to claim. But Milton's vision was incomplete, and he knew it. He couldn't quite explain who __quote_20__ were in a practical legal sense. He gestured at it. He circled it. He didn't solve it. The man who got closest to solving it was John Locke. His answer arrived in 1689, 40 years after the execution, published in the chaos of yet another constitutional crisis, the Glorious Revolution, which finally established parliamentary supremacy in England for good. Locke wrote his 2 treatises of government, and in them he laid out a theory that was, in its bones, the logical completion of everything that had been argued, fought over, and bled for since the first day Charles walked into Westminster Hall without removing his hat. Government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. When government violates the rights of the people, the natural rights that exist prior to any government, the rights that no king and no parliament can simply take, the people have not just the right, but the duty to alter or abolish it. Read that last phrase again. Alter or abolish it.
Now open the Declaration of Independence to its second paragraph, where Thomas Jefferson wrote that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Jefferson didn't copy Locke word for word. He didn't have to. The thinking had become the water everyone swam in. It had been there for 130 years, accumulating force, crossing an ocean, finding new soil in communities built by the very people who had first felt the weight of Charles Stuart's personal rule. The men who signed the American Declaration of Independence knew the story of the English Civil War. They knew it intimately. John Adams wrote about it. Jefferson had Locke in his library and read him obsessively. Benjamin Franklin grew up in a Boston shaped by Puritan political culture, the same culture that had provided Cromwell's armies with their most fervent soldiers. When Patrick Henry stood up in the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1765 and warned George III that kings who ignored the rights of their subjects had historically faced consequences, the people in that room understood the reference without needing him to spell it out. The entire intellectual architecture of the American founding, consent of the governed, natural rights, the right of revolution, the absolute illegitimacy of power exercised without accountability, runs in direct, traceable lines back to the arguments made in Westminster Hall in January 1649. When the Constitutional Convention in 1787 spent months arguing about executive power, how much to give the president, what limits to impose, how to prevent the presidency from becoming what Charles had been, they were still, in a very real sense, working through the same fundamental problem. How do you build a system of government that is powerful enough to function and accountable enough to be legitimate?
How do you give one person executive authority without making them a tyrant? They didn't fully solve it either. Nobody has. That's not a failure. That's the nature of the problem. It's a problem that Charles Stuart's execution put on the table, and that every democracy since has been wrestling with in one form or another. The forms change. The digital authoritarian, the elected strongman, the executive who governs by emergency decree. These are new costumes on a very old conflict. 37 people were directly tried for their role in Charles's execution after the monarchy was restored. 9 were hanged, drawn, and quartered, the medieval punishment for treason, grotesque and deliberate, a message about what happened to men who killed kings. The body of Oliver Cromwell was dug up from Westminster Abbey, where it had been buried with full state honors and subjected to a posthumous execution. hanged in chains, beheaded, the head put on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it stayed for 20 years. The thing that people found when they finally took it down and tried to figure out what to do with it, the preserved, desiccated, spike-punctured skull of the man who had remade England, passed through private hands for centuries, displayed, hidden, sold, until it was finally given a quiet burial in Cambridge in 1960. 300 years after he died, they were still arguing about what to do with him. 3 of the men who signed the death warrant, Edward Whalley, William Gough, and John Dixwell, made it to New England. They were sheltered by communities that considered what they'd done not a crime, but a calling. Whalley and Gough lived for years in caves and attics in Massachusetts and Connecticut, hunted by royal agents who never quite caught them, protected by colonists who built their houses around the idea that Charles had deserved what he got. There are towns in New England named for these men, streets that still carry their names. The ghost of 1649, embedded in American geography, in American political thought, in the specific texture of American suspicion toward concentrated power. The head of Charles I was sewn back onto his body before burial. He was interred at Windsor Castle, in St. George's Chapel, in a vault alongside Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. No public funeral was allowed. Cromwell's government was afraid of what a public funeral might become. He went into the ground quietly, in February, in the cold, surrounded by a small group of people whose faces we can't see now, and whose words, if they said anything at all, were not recorded. He was 48 years old. He had been king for 24 years and had made almost every mistake a king could make. He had been inflexible when flexibility might have saved him, and principled in ways that cost him everything. He loved his wife and his children, and his church, and his absolute conviction that God had placed him above accountability, and that conviction killed him as surely as the axe did. He was not a great ruler, but he died like something more than what he'd lived as, and the manner of his dying sent a signal across time that turned out to be louder and more consequential than anything he ever said or did with his crown on his head. Because the question his execution posed never went away. It just kept traveling forward, changing languages, changing costumes, landing in different rooms in front of different people who had to decide, each time, what to do with it. Whether a ruler can be held to account, whether power has limits, whether the governed get a say, whether the answer to tyranny is negotiation, or something harder and more dangerous and less reversible. Every election is a partial answer. Every journalist who publishes something a government would prefer stayed quiet. All of them partial answers to a question first raised in the most dramatic way possible on a frozen January morning outside a London palace. Charles stretched out his hands, and the world has been answering him ever since. Think about that the next time someone tells you that what politicians do in distant capitals has nothing to do with your life. The man on that scaffold believed the same thing about Parliament, right up until the moment Parliament built the scaffold.